Today, this was born out of things that I do regularly to gather some proactive data for my databases. And most of it is really due to the topic that we have publicized. I didn't put it on the slide, but really gathering data using PowerShell for trending. So trending is something that I don't know if it's a dying art or one that's being revived, but this is what we're going to talk about. The big thing for me, I'm a big SMO proponent, so I like SMO a lot. There's goods and bads. There's some things that it does well, and there's some things that I wish it would do better. But that's why we have community, so we can feed those things back and get more things behind, or more voice behind it, as we've heard from Chrissy and Aaron today. Getting behind outdated tables is huge. So we're going to talk about the database object information, and basically in this presentation, we're going to talk about these three things to gather, and then we're going to have a demo that just shows you methods that you can use to gather. That's one of the hardest parts with programming with PowerShell and other things, is that there's probably 17 ways to do it, and you end up having to figure out which way is the best way. And honestly, you'll find out that the best way will be dependent upon how you think. And we'll get into that later. But the first thing we're going to talk about is the database object information. The database object is probably one of the largest objects in the SMO family. There's others, but the server and database tend to be the most rich with properties. We're going to talk about that. Then performance counters. This is an area where I'm just beginning to gather stuff. There's a lot of tools like perfmon, things like that. We'll talk more about those and how to get perf counters and other things related to the OS. And then engine and environment information. So this could cover part of the server object as well as some WMI and things like that. We are going to talk a little bit about DBA tools in the demo and things that we use there. So good shout out to the awesome DBA tools team. And then just the methods of gathering. We're going to go over some methods of how you do it. And you're going to see most of this in demo of how you would actually go about gathering the information. We are going to use DBA tools to do out data table or out DBA data table, because that's been a core function of mine that I've used a lot. And we're also going to use write data table. So let's get started. This is here just for the link. So there's a link for the SQL Server PowerShell Stairway on SQL Server Central. And I'm in the process of trying to get that updated. It's outdated. It was written back in 2012, I believe, or 2010 and 11 and 12. But I'm going to update it. All the information there is still valid as far as the methods and the stairways for the levels. So learning PowerShell and learning about connecting it to SQL is still valid. It just is using outdated technology as far as in the tables. I don't show the newest versions of the OSs, but they're still there, so it's all good. Another shout out to PowerShell Deep Dives book is a book written by a lot of the PowerShell MVPs. They invited me to write a chapter on SMO, so that was a really good fun thing, but it's out there for if you want to dive into PowerShell and have some fun. So let's talk about the database object information. So first off, there's 192 properties in the database object, which is pretty big in my opinion for an object. Anybody who's done object-oriented programming in the past, you typically don't have that many properties in an object. It gets to be fairly large, but in this case, SMO is really meant to model or represent the properties that you would find inside SQL Server. So there are quite a few, and many of them are not in sys databases. So sys databases has a lot of properties for a database, and you can get them out of master. So some of this is very efficient. Other properties are not so prevalent in the master database. They actually are in each database. So database options and other things that you would set are actually living in the database and are not represented inside the sys databases. So having this big of an object for me gives me an opportunity to have a one-stop shop to get some things out without having to do a ton of T-SQL querying to get the data out. Again, more than one way. You pick your poison. If you like to do T-SQL for some things and you can get it faster and you like it better, that's great. I tend to use SMO because It spans different versions of SQL, and when a property is available, it's available. And if I'm going to down level databases, which I do often with clients, you end up wanting a database property that is in the current version but wasn't in the previous version, and you just won't get a piece of data. It won't error. It will just omit that property as a value because you went to a down level database that doesn't have that property. So I like the programming model of SMO, so I don't have to manage my T-SQL, but at the same time, it just depends on what you're doing. If you're always working with the same engine version, then you're good. I don't tend to do that. So there's 45 collections. So I say 190 properties, but there's 45 collections that contain more objects. So if you think about SQL Server and you think about expanding things in SSMS, you're going to have the collection of tables. You're going to have a collection of properties that are pertaining to that object, as well as indexes and extended events and all the things that come inside the database where you can expand that thing, security and users and roles and all that stuff. So collections also contain more properties that you can mine in one object. And then there's 73 methods to actually do something with the object. And we're not going to talk about the methods today, just because that's more of a DBA function, not a gathering data. But there are some things in the methods that you will do to enumerate things, and that becomes pretty important too. So in the demo, we'll show you more of the object to show you what we're going to do, and we're going to do a little fun demo that gathers some data and stuffs it into a table. So pretty fun deal. So the reason this is important isn't because the database object in SMO is the most awesome thing in the world. It's because as a DBA or as a person wanting to get more information to store for proactive information or for trending, such as database space, these are questions that you might ask when you come into a new environment, or when you have somebody that's your superior ask, hey, how many databases do you have? I once asked that question to somebody who I was interviewing with, and they told me straight up that they really didn't think that was a relevant thing to ask. And I thought, okay, so if I'm going to come in to a new environment, I need to know how many instances I have, how many databases I have, and then I need to know some of these other properties. So these are some of the questions I ask. How many tables do I have in each database? If you're dealing with an SAP database, you're going to probably have 96,000 tables. If you're going to deal with GP data, or you're going to deal with CRM, you're going to have a different number of tables. And that may not matter much unless you have certain tables that are huge and you need to manage the space, or you need to manage the free space in the database where you don't run out and have it auto grow. That becomes important to know how many things you have, because automations can run short or long based on how many objects you're playing with. So that's a pretty important question. How many databases do you have that don't have the page verify equal to checksum? So then maybe they're torn page detection because they were upgraded from SQL 2000, or they were some other mechanism came across, or somebody just changed them to none, or something happened and it became none. And that means you don't get checksums in your page headers. Well, that's not a good thing if you want to ward off any corruption that can be auto fixed by checksum. Not many people know. They just have databases. They come into an environment and they don't have any idea. Nor do they sometimes change them. I mean, that I've had it where I've come into an environment and DBAs had been there for years, and there's torn page detection and none everywhere. And I'm just, wow, how was that a good thing? How many rows are in each table? And what if you're in a SaaS platform? A SaaS platform would have multiple databases if you're if you're a single tenant, and you'd have that many tables across that many databases, and you need to know the lay of the land for that. So trending that is a very important thing. And then how much data is in my database compared to how much index space is in my database. So a lot of times people won't know that there's 50 times as many bytes in index as there are in the data, and that could be a good thing, Or it could be a bad thing. When there's a highly written to database, you could have a problem with the index space being too large. If you never check that, and you never look at how many indexes are in each table, you never look at other things like that before, you'll never figure out some of the problems that you have in your environment. You'll always think that tuning is all about adding indexes instead of removing them or consolidating. And this is what I use my data for in the database object that I gather. And all the questions that you typically will answer, especially on this slide, are in the SMO database object. Let's talk about performance counters. Performance counters are another thing that, like I said, I'm kind of new to them. I've used them in perfmon, but getting them out using PowerShell, I haven't done that a lot, and I haven't actually taken a perfmon trace and actually shredded it into a table so I could trend how things are doing. Most of the performance counters are typically managed by a tool. So you could use any third-party tool. You could use Performance Data Warehouse. There's lots of things that gather these things and put them into a graph. And you watch the CPU, or you watch the log bytes written to, the log bytes read. You look at the size, as we illustrate here, the log file use size. Those things that you might care about, but might be something you don't gather in another way. There's perf counters for a lot of the stuff that you're going to gather, such as the log file use. I can get that in SMO, but there's a counter that keeps track of that. The great thing to do is to go into your sysdm OS performance counters and look at what's available. There are so many performance counters available there and kept up to date that could be a good starting place. And that's where I started. So people look at PLE, and you might do a report in SQL by right-clicking and then doing reports and saying memory consumption, or you might use a different one that has the space. And it will have some of the performance counters there for PLE and things like that. They exist as counters. They're not just things that are inside SQL. They're actually a performance counter that the OS has available to perfmon. So performance counters is a great way to get trending as well for things that you might not get inside SQL easily. You could get the counter for CPU and stuff a lot more simple, I think, in perfmon or in this get counter, and store it in a table. The other thing that is interesting for those of you who have many servers, and you have a lot of databases underneath those servers, sometimes looking at the server edition and version can tell you a story about what you have in your environment. You may not know that you have 14 standard editions and 52 enterprise editions. Why are we having standard, and is there a reason to do standard, or are we on a VM platform? And those are things that you'll want to know if you're going to trend data across. The idea of having these features, or you might call them values, available to you. Do you know how many instances you have that have max memory and min memory set on your instance? I've found environments where you go in as a consultant and you find out that this still has a 2 terabyte limit, and it still has the 0 minimum server, and all of the defaults of the SP configure are all defaults as if you just installed SQL, and yet it's been running for 3 years. So some of these pieces are not necessarily for trending, but you'd gather them to see when they changed and what they changed to. So you might gather them today, and you gather them tomorrow, and you gather them the next day, and you might find over time that min server or max server memory changes over time if you have a team of DBAs and you're not the sole DBA, because if you're not the sole DBA, then somebody else could have changed it, and it's good to know when things change, when somebody comes to you and say, yesterday it worked great, today it doesn't work so great. And you could go back to this data that you gathered, and you could look at what the state of the server was, at least at the point in time when you took the data. So gathering data for trending is really important. Gathering data for context, I think, is also just as important, so that you can see what is actually taking place and why things might be behaving differently as you tweak settings over time. I'm not a believer of setting and forgetting in the server environment. I don't micromanage it, but I like to get to a sweet spot of where I do cost threshold for parallelism, how many max stop I have in my settings, and those kind of things are things I like to watch and see how, if I change the cost threshold 5 points, does it change the behavior of the server drastically? Does it improve performance? Do I get less wait times and those kind of things? So setting and forgetting is nice, but at this point, there is a idea that we can affect our server by having more information than less information. So data gathering can span all those scenarios. So methods to gather. So as you can see, we're getting through our slides pretty quick, but demo is pretty heavy as far as time consuming. So we're gonna spend more time in code than we are in slides. So don't worry. There's a lot of. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, you're also free to go a little bit past the 30-minute mark. Sorry, the end of the hour. We do have people that stay on past that, and we will have it available on YouTube. So.
Okay, great. So the methods are a few. So one of the methods you can gather information is WMI. So if you haven't ever used WMI inside PowerShell, there is a get WMI object. There's also other things like get CIM session and other things that you can use to gather information that is natively kept in the operating system. WMI stands for Windows Management Instrumentation, which means that you end up with a lot of information that is just part of your operating system that you may not ever look at because you're a SQL Server DBA or you work in SQL Management Studio. Those are great tools, but WMI has a wealth of information that is available to us, even in DBA tools, which we'll talk about in a minute. Uses a lot of stuff in the OS to get data about your disk drives and about other things that we care about. So don't discount WMI as a source of information to get information about your OS. SMO is the big one we're going to use today. And the reason mainly is because the object has properties and SMO will generate the T-SQL I need for the instance and the version of SQL that it's talking to. So I don't need to worry about what the T-SQL is behind it. The thing I didn't put on the slide is you can use T-SQL. I mean, you're welcome if you're a good query writer and you know a lot of the DMVs. A lot of the DMVs are not represented in SMO. They just aren't, because that's not a property. It's actually a DMV. It's a dynamic management view, and they're there for a purpose. So sometimes, and even in my data gathering for index usage stats, I use the DMV. I write my own T-SQL and gather the columns I want, and I stuff it into a table because I can't get it in SMO. It's not possible. So there are reasons to use both, or even WMI, SMO, and T-SQL. So you just mix and match. The beauty of PowerShell is that it can bind them all together in a great, nice little package that you can use logic. You can branch with if-thens, you can do try catches, you can do all sorts of stuff to get your data where it belongs and allow yourself some flexibility in what you do and how you do it. And then the last one on the slide is modules. So modules are becoming, in my world, they're becoming more valuable. I'm writing my own modules, or at least internal ones that I use, functions that wouldn't necessarily be something that everybody else would use, but it's very specific to my environment. And so I might write a little module that has functions that do specific things for our environment, and I put them in a module so I can import module and just have them there. DBA tools is one of those modules that you can mine a lot of things from, and that's a beauty that you get, that there's a community project that people are developing, and I'm actually trying to contribute as well. I've contributed a little bit, but only fixes, not necessarily module functions. But you can do it too. I mean, that's the beauty of a module, is that you can contribute a function to a module, and it can be available to everybody, one that's very useful, and it can be a source of information. So DBA Tools has a get DBA disk space, and that's one of the things that I trend is disk space as we go, and I watch day after day to see where my data space goes, which drive is going down, and I marry that up with my other information I get from the database object with the data space that's being taken up in the database and the database size, and I watch that trend. I can correlate that because I know the files that are in the database and what drives they live on. And so all of a sudden I have a great wealth of information that I can use with a module, with SMO, with WMI, and all the other things to put into my little store. And then my job is to write queries to get the information to be, to get the data I gathered into information, right? And hopefully then the information will move to intelligence. So the two modules I illustrate is DBA Tools, which is growing day by day, has a wealth of information for the DBAs that want data. And the other beauty is that it's not just a source, it's actually a tool that you can do stuff with to manage your database. So PowerShell becomes pretty powerful that way. The SQL Server module is also growing, not at probably the pace of DBA Tools, but the SQL Server module, which is now available through the PowerShell Gallery. Yay! Thanks to Aaron and Chrissy for being the little hammers that kept on pounding. It was great. And all of you community members who've chimed in as well to help Ken at Microsoft get the right things there and to get that module finally installable without having to install Management Studio to get it, which is a cheer for me. That was my big pain. I like to run Server Core, and you can install Management Studio on Server Core, so you just don't get the SQL Server module. The other beauty I'll just say is about the SQL Server module is that the introduction of that module to PowerShell Gallery has now allowed that module to be transportable. So you could install it from the PowerShell Gallery, and they have self-contained it. So there are no dependencies outside of that folder. So I actually could pick up and copy that folder and copy it somewhere else to another modules folder on another machine, and it is self-contained where I can just import module, SQL Server, and it runs just great. So one of the beauties of the PowerShell Gallery is they become self-contained and they have no dependencies, which I love.
And one thing to add to that, because I got dinged for forgetting to add it, was that it works on Server Core.
I know. I like it. That's why I say I love it's transportable and it works on Server Core. So I'm very happy.
I keep forgetting to mention Server Core. So
yeah, they make me happy whenever that happens. I just like Server Core. Maybe one day Nano, but we'll take Server Core right now. All right, that's all I have for the slides, other than we'll come back and do a review. But we're going to go into demo right now so we can watch some fun stuff happen. And I don't want to do updates, so I'm just, maybe it will not let me do it. Let's bear with this poor little guy while it has a cow, and we'll come to our demo. Boy, that's really crazy. Okay, it looks like the app hung. That's kind of not good either. We'll go back in. Ah, there we go. So hopefully you've all seen some things that take place inside the world of SMO. If you haven't, then you'll see some new things. I'm going to demonstrate 3 different ways to gather the data, and we're going to empty out some tables. What I have for and Aaron and Chrissy, you can tell me how I would best distribute the scripts. I haven't done anything as far as created a repository yet on a GitHub. Looks like I'm going to have to shut this guy down and restart him.
That's actually one of the things that I really love about the DBA Tools community project is that, something that's useful to you will most likely be useful to me as a fellow DBA. And so to distribute it, talk to me and then we'll see if it fits in, because it probably will.
Okay, great. But yeah, I just want to make sure if you guys want the scripts that we get them to you.
Sweet. And I also have internal versions similar to you. I recently started making modules for PowerShell like for a specific client. And I think that's just such an amazing way to go. And I think that one of my future presentations will be about that.
Yeah, it becomes a pretty important thing. At least, I mean, in my world, the gathering of data becomes somewhat what would you call it, proprietary or whatever, IP or whatever you want to call it, but most often the IP can be leveraged, and so it's a good thing to have maybe even personal versions, but then to leverage that and you make them more public to where people allowed things to go. So the first, we're just going to talk about 3 different methods to get the data inside your place. And so let's make sure the instance is started. And it is running, so that's good. So you'll see that at the top, I like AdType to load my assembly. You'll see it several different ways. You might see load with partial name. You might see other ways. I do AdType so I can specify the version. So I have version 14 actually on here. I've installed the Management Studio 17, which contains the version 14 of SMO. And as well, the SQL Server module also has version 14.0 as part of its embedded thing. I do a little shortcut here with my SMO to specify my prefix to all my objects so that I can just use $SMO.server. It's just shortcut for me, so I can not have to type the whole thing or have the big string in there, make my line long. But basically in this scenario, we're just going to create a server object that points to our local instance. And there I have it, and it's going to behave. Oh, how do I move my little box guy to be not where my script? Okay, there we go. I just need my little script button here. So there we go. All right, so we're going to think about gathering the ID, the name of the database, the size of the database, the data space usage, index space usage, latch backup date, recovery model, page verify, compatibility level, and is read, commit, snapshot on. So those are the properties we're going to capture. And the table we would create, I have my own stats database table, so we had to create a table database 2 because I have a bigger stats gathering that has a lot more columns than this, but for purposes of demo, I didn't want to like go through all of the things and make the code look really hairy. But that was what I was talking about. How do I distribute the scripts? Because I don't mind giving the full gathering scripts I have currently away to have people like either embellish them or use them or whatever. So this is just a short version. So the first way we're going to do, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit because Chrissy will understand a lot more about this because she did a presentation a long time ago that tested the performance of things like out null and out string and stuff like that. So in my last class, I just taught for SQL Skills, an immersion event for PowerShell. We actually did some tests in there, and I thought it was rather interesting, so I thought I'd make them part of this. Typically, you would see the code for getting everything in an array, just basically a list, to be something like array equals the @ and then the empty array. And the PowerShell array is an immutable object like strings. If you don't know what immutable means, it means that when I add something to the array, like this guy, I use add here, but to add something here in this array, I would say array plus equals the value or the object. And every time I do that, the first array is thrown away and a new array is created, and that object gets added to that array. So if you do it a lot of times, in this case, there's not very many databases, so it wouldn't do a ton. Oh boy, please don't do that again. Okay, there we go. I get to just exit out of this. When you do that a lot, there's a lot of garbage collection that has to happen in order to clean up your environment, so it gets pretty slow. So in the test we did, we ran 100,000 iterations of just adding an object to an array. And it was abysmal in speed. It was pretty bad. And I wasn't even having a complex object. It was just really a simple object with a couple properties. And it took a long, long time to do 100,000 iterations just straight out. But as soon as I used a collections.array list, which is a .NET type, and just typed my array, and said equals the @ %% or parentheses, so it initializes my array. It was milliseconds. It was beautiful. So I've illustrated that here. If you're going to do an array to gather them, you should use this collections array list. For speed, if you're only going to do 10 objects, you don't remember this collections array list, then it doesn't matter. But I just wanted to illustrate that you could have issues with speed in that space. So the first thing we do is get the databases from our server with server.databases. We do for each DB in the server.databases, so I have an actual database object I can mess with. And then inside my loop, I create me a new object. So dbObj becomes a quote. I don't know if you've seen this syntax, but I like it because I don't like to do the new PS object and then have to add properties with add member. It looks really horrible and it's slow, and I mean, it's a lot of code, and I just think it's not necessary for what I do. So I basically pipe an empty string into a select statement that basically select objects, the column names. So these are all my column names in my object. So they become properties. They become note properties by default. And this will create me one object called dbObj, and it will be a PS object, but it will be of type selected string. But the base type doesn't matter because it all ends up as a PS object anyway. So now I have real properties that I can say dbObj.id, dbObj.name, and all my properties I've specified in the select become full-blown objects. Now, they don't really have types because they're note properties. So this is the first method that basically runs and populates these properties with things from the DB. Here's my DB object, and I have all these properties in the database object that I can gather and put in these note properties. Size goes in a note property, even though we know that the size is really a number. And that's one of the things that you get with this version, is that it's just an object. There's a note property, and that's what happens. Is that bad or good? That's really up to you. But this is one of the ways to do it. I do a void here because the array list is different than the array plus equals, in that it does return something. It returns the ID of the next array, or of the current array index. So I void that so I don't see it. So if it's in a loop in a function, I don't get output that goes out to my receiving property. And then after I get done, I have all of them in this array, and this is not immutable. It actually adds it to a collection, so it actually allocates memory, puts it in there, and it doesn't throw it away like an immutable array in PowerShell. Then I use my data table, out DBA data table, which is in DBA tools, which is I believe it's a adaptation of the out data table that Chad Miller created a long time ago. At least that's what I assume, and it works the same way. My input object is array, and it turns it into a real data table, a system.data.data table, and then I use SQL Server modules write-SQL data table. I could use DBA tools write-DBA data table as well. It works the same. Well, it works differently in that I'll explain when we get to the other method. But basically, pass my server instance, my database name, my schema name, my table name, and input data, and it stuffs the data in from the data table into my actual table. So it works pretty well. We're going to open up Management Studio here and demo this, and then we'll demo the last one. We won't demo all of them, but here's my Management Studio 17. How are we doing with questions? Any questions coming in so far, or?
Sure. We've got one asking about AdType versus LoadPartialName.
Okay. So
which is the right way to do it?
Right. So which one's the right way to do it? AdType? Yeah, it is. So the difference is that AdType, you can actually, you use the strong name, which means you give the name of the assembly, and then you can specify a version. All of this stuff afterwards, culture equals neutral, public key token, those are all identical for all versions of PowerShell's, for MySQL Server's SMO. So SMO has the same public key token, the same culture. The difference is that if you use a strong name, you get what you expect. So if you're coding your SMO to version 14, then you will always have the luxury of knowing what your namespaces are, what your objects are in that namespace. So when you load it and you've coded to 14 and 14's not on there, you might not want to run your automation if you use specific things in there. So AdType just gives you a way to load an assembly in PowerShell the PowerShell way. If you use load with partial name or load file or load from, those are .NET ways. So you have to specify a reflection.assembly, and then you have to do : load with partial name. And the difference with load with partial name than AdType is that you can only specify the partial name. It won't let you specify a version. It won't let you, and then the behavior of that is it loads the latest version on the server. So if you've coded to 13 and 14's on there, this will load 14 for you instead of 13. So it's not very specific, but it is easy. So you don't have to do the culture neutral and public key token. You use quickly. It's a down and dirty thing to me, but I don't like it.
I do want to throw in two things. First is that I actually used the load partial name for a long time because whenever I would do AdType in Microsoft SQL Server SMO, it would always throw an error. And I think that it's because AdType has to be programmed in by the PowerShell team. So they have like a very specific library. And I believe that it only works in older environments. Otherwise, you do have to be super specific. But you don't have to worry about that if you do import module SQL Server, because it will give you all of the SMO stuff that you need, and or even importing DBA tools we give the latest version.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, with Microsoft, they give a very specific version. Which, hey, Aaron, do you know if the one in the gallery is that for 2017's?
Yes.
SMO? It is. Oh, so
it
you
is.
know as well. Yep. Cool. Awesome.
Yep,
Alrighty.
it is. I just used it last week.
Awesome.
So the other thing to add on to what Chrissy said, the AdType, if you use a weak name like I did with load with partial name, and I just use this guy, the SQL Server.smo, I don't specify a version. The PowerShell team governs which assembly it loads. And today, the PowerShell team has written into PowerShell that if it sees the weak name of Microsoft SQL Server SMO, it runs version 9.0.242.0, which is should not be on anybody's box. Should not be on anybody's box because that was V1, and you shouldn't. Just don't do that. Just don't. So you would want to specify the strong name, which is the whole version string, if you're going to do AdType with assembly name, because you'll get what you expect. You won't get what you expect if you use the weak name. So that's why I like AdType.
I really love that you know it to like the minor build. That's super awesome.
it's you've seen enough red on the screen. It's all good. It's just you memorize those numbers and go. That's not a good thing to see. You just don't want to see the little number in the middle. That's terrible. So yeah, that's why I use that. So hopefully that answers the question of why you'd use either one. The other thing I don't like about the load with partial name is it's deprecated from .NET, which means at any time Microsoft could remove it and your automation stop working on the new servers that you would implement on. And that would be detrimental to things. You'd have to go rewrite everywhere you use load with partial name, you have to do it. Now, Microsoft has not removed it yet. And just like mirroring in SQL, who knows when it will be removed, but do you really want to be sitting on a ticking time bomb? I don't, so I typically don't use the methods that are deprecated, so I don't have to worry about in case they decide to get a wild hair and remove it, it's gone, so it's not good. So let's look in Management Studio. I should have a demo database here that has my little tables in it. We're just going to truncate the table. So we have database 2 here. If I were to do a query and see what was in that table, dbo.stats database 2, would see that we have some data I gathered before. We're going to truncate that table just so that we don't have any data, so you can see it actually took place. So if I select now, it won't be anything there. The other thing I implement that is not in the slide deck or the demo is that there is an iterations table. So there's an iterations table for me to have a iteration ID, which is just basically a big int identity, and then a gather date, so that I can put an iteration ID every time I gather. I put an iteration ID in the table with the stats. So you can see is at the end of my query, there's an iteration ID at the end of the table. And that is because I want to compare iterations. So if I run the script every day, then I can compare today with yesterday, today with last week, today with last month. I can do a month worth of data. I can do a year worth of data, however long I've captured the data. I can actually compare each individual iteration with each other. So I like that. The other thing I'll tell you that you'll see in the information is that the iteration ID is at the end of the table, and there's a reason. When you use write-SQL data table or write-data table or whatever you use to stuff that data into SQL, it uses a bulk copy mechanism, and the bulk copy mechanism will actually not care what your names of your columns are. They will care about the order of your table, and you'll see where that's really important in some of the next ways we gather data. But I put the iteration ID at the end because if I don't, I have to have an empty column in front so that it will do order and put it in the right columns, and it will ignore the identity because I'll just leave a null in there, and it will ignore that column in the bulk copy. But you'll want to make sure that you deal in order. And this is why it's important in this case, because when you do the select, your note properties do go into the object in that order. So order becomes really imperative. So the second, and I think we're just going to execute this one just to watch it run. It should just run, and hopefully I won't get any red on my screen. Okay, I didn't get any red on my screen, which is great. Now if I run this guy, I should have data in my table. Ta-da! There's my databases. There's my data space usage. There's my data index space usage. Notice it came in as .00, and remember these are note properties, not data properties for numbers, as well as the date. Look at the date came into a certain date format, and there's my recovery model, my page verify, compatibility level, is read, committed snapshot, and there's my iteration ID at the end. So those are kind of cool, but the important thing to remember is make sure you put the things in order, regardless of the method. So this is one method where we use an object. Now let's look at the second method. We do the same thing at top, add type, do your SQL Server, grab your SQL Server. It's going to be the same table. And I have a function that I've written that's not here, but I have it written and I just illustrate it here. My iteration ID is get stats iteration ID from the instance in the database name. And there should actually be a database name here. And it gives me my iteration ID, which I then put in here. For this purpose, I've hard coded it. So I'm going to put 2 here so that we know this is second iteration. But this is the other way that you can, this is one other way to do it. So you saw me do the collections array list, so that's common. I do for each DB, and then look at what I do with DB_obj. Instead of doing new DB_obj equals select object and having all my columns all the way out here and then using them, this is another way you can use a hash table. So you can actually do a new object, PS object, with a property of, and you need to do, if you're going to do this ordered hash table, a lot of people will just take off the ordered and they'll just do without ordered. What that does is that the interesting thing about hash tables is hash tables will allow you to put names and values together, but there is no predefined order that you'll get them out. So you think, hey, if I put in an ordered list of my properties for my hash table, I would get them out in that same order, and that is not true. It's one of those weird things about hash tables. You don't get that luxury. So in order to make in version 3, this is a version 3 feature, you had to do ordered in front of the hash table, and then all of the hash table names will go in order as you put them in. But in order to do that here with a new PS object, you have to do a parenthesis and a parenthesis so that it evaluates the ordered first and then puts them into properties in the PS object. So just remember, this is the example that you should template if you're going to use this way. But what was come up with in the class is a student said, if you do it this way, I only define the ID or the columns one time, and I do them in definition as far as the values go into it right on definition, rather than doing a new PS object or doing a select with all the property names, which I had to do them all on one line, and then I came back and did the db dot, and then it's like, well, why do that if you can do them in one swoop? So we figured we'd do a demo here and show you that option. Basically, each line is considered a new property in this hash table. So you don't need commas. So you notice there's no commas, and you don't need anything else other than just every one of them on a separate line, and you're all good. And you don't need semicolons, which is typical in a hash table if you're going to define it by yourself. So no commas, no semicolons. They just, each line becomes a separate property. And then I end it with my end hash table. I end it with my parenthesis, and then that gets stuffed into this new PS object. So pretty slick on that respect, and it's kind of nice. And then I do a DT again without data table. My input object is the array, and then I write SQL data table just like I did before. So two different ways to do property-based, object-based. This is the last way that, again, there's probably more ways, but these were the most prevalent in our minds as far as what you can do. So same thing here, add assembly, server, same table. This is where we get into creating our own data table. So we skip a step at the end. In out data table, we create our own. So we do new type name as system.data.data table. We name it, and then we put argument list with ID. So this is kind of like our PS object with creating our properties manually. But this is the benefit, is I can put in a type. So I can actually allow a certain type to be had in my data, and that really helps a lot. In that, if I intend it to be numeric data like this, I can actually get more decimal places or whatever by using a decimal data type, and I can do some formatting in my assignments so that I get all the data I want the way it to look. Now, you saw that we did the first example and we stuffed it into a table, and we did see the data come out with .00, but what if I wanted 4 zeros? Well, there's really no, I could format it in a text way in my previous example, but that seems like a lot of work to do. I'm just wanting to gather data in its native form. And so I can specify a max length, which should match my length in my column in the table. And that way I can make sure that my automation actually won't blow up because of types being too long or too short. So this is creating a data table, and basically I would create a new object for a data column, and I would put them in variables. Again, this is kind of wasteful because once I get done using them, they kind of have to be garbage collected. But then I add my columns in the right order that I want them. So I could actually, the iteration IDs at the end. So that's my last column, and I add that to the last. And data tables, when you add columns, they do preserve order because you added it the way you wanted to in the columns, and they do keep their ordinal number. This is how it looks different when we use a data table. So it's a little more code to define up top. But then I do the same thing for each DB in server databases. I do a row equals a data table.new row, which will give me an empty row. I populate all the properties in my row right here with the row dot column name and equal db dot column or property name. And then I put the iteration ID in here, and we'll make that a 3. And then I do rows dot add, and I do the row add. Once I have that, I don't do, notice down here on the, I don't have an out dash data table. I just go straight to the right dash SQL data table. So those are kind of cool things, but this one works just as well. I have not ever done a, what would you call it, a performance test or performance thing to see which one's faster as far as execution or adding rows or adding numbers to it. They both work. I haven't really embarked on that. So if you want to test it, it would be a fun little deal to test. If I execute that here, now I should see 2 sets, and we see iteration ID 3 down here because we didn't execute 2, and the data is still the same. Notice, 0, 0, 0, 0. So they're they really didn't change much in format in how they came in because they're dates in the table, not strings. So everything seemed to work fine. So you get to choose how you want to do it. It just depends on how you want to do it. Outside of that, there's one other thing that I don't really demo here, but I want to call your attention to it. Write SQL data table in the SQL Server module has one feature that I believe was heavily asked for, and that is if I write dash SQL data table or SQL table data, if I do that commandlet and I don't have the table created yet, I can actually specify this guy and say we'll do 3 because we know that doesn't exist, and we're going to say if my thing will behave -force. And -force on write SQL table data will actually create the table for you. Now I'll warn you, I'm going to execute it just for fun and show you what it creates, but just to warn you, as you look at the idea, hey, I'll just create my data table with write SQL table data and I'll do a -force, you can do that. It works. But what you will lose is you will get some interesting things for if it decides to work, because it's in a demo, it'll probably fail because it loves me. Come on. Let's see if it's created it already. Oh, it's creating it. Good. There we go. Database 3. So it should have finished. And database 3, I'll just expand this guy and show you that this is the gift that is given to you when you don't have foresight to create your own table. Every string column will become an nvarchar max. Okay, so if you have 15 characters and you really don't care, and it should be, if you compare database 2, you'll see that name actually is nvarchar 128 because it's a sysname. But then you come down here and see recovery models actually varchar 15, page verifies varchar 20. You get, in write SQL table data, you get nvarchar max. So that might not be very advantageous or desirable to you. So you might decide not to use that. The one benefit to it is this. If I write SQL table data with a -force, it'll create my table. If I want to come doctor up this, I can alter this name type to be my nvarchar 128, and it will let me as long as the data is not too long. The reason I don't like this is because I'm a purist, and once I've messed my database pages up with this stuff, all the things I go and rename or rechange my types or whatever, I leave my table in SQL Server's hands to be the way it wants it, and whether it moves the pages or whether it changes it now or whether it waits for a metadata change, I don't get to govern that. I don't like that, so I tend to take control. But notice it created a big int, so you do get ints and big ints when the data is in there, but those are a lot less innocuous than a decimal 28,14, which if I have that big of a database with data space usage, I have a different problem than having my size be that big. I have a database that's humongous. So I have to think about it differently. But that's just what happens when you go. The columns for decimal and date time and strings are the most impacted by the write SQL table data with -force. So hopefully that was helpful to see, but they all work. Each one of these methods work, and it just depends on what you choose and what you like. Some people like to be purists and they create their own data table with their columns. Some people don't want that and they want it really simple and elegant looking. That's pretty short and concise using a hash table. And then some people like their little objects, which you can add properties to later and add more data and stuff like that. So each one of these is a method. So let's go back and finish the review. So basically, we went over database object information. The way you tell how many objects there are is using getMember, which I didn't show, I apologize. But there's a lot of information, and sometimes it's just fun to go in and get a database object from your database and do a pipe to a FL star and just get every property that exists and have it show you on the screen to see what values are in there. It does take a little bit to do that because that's a lot of properties, and SMO has to generate all the T-SQL to go get it. We talked about performance counters. Goof around with get counter. It's really interesting, but you can basically get your counters with get counter, and then you can do a sample of however much you want, or you can do a continuous to get that in a different window. And then check out what's in SysDMOS performance counters. Just see what's there. There's a lot of information that you can mine without having to worry too much about it. and then play with the WMI and SMO. I didn't really show you the DBA tools get DBA disk space, but what I wanted to show there, and I'll just quickly show you in a window, is the idea. If I import module DBA tools, and I say get DBA disk space, and there's an alias that you can just omit the DBA as well if you want. But if I get DBA disk space, notice it doesn't come out. But this is really slow for some reason. My VM is probably having a cow, but that's okay. Basically, it comes out in FL, which is like, whoa, what? I want it in a pretty table format. Well, the reason why it doesn't come out in a pretty table format is so that you can actually use this as data and do a where clause. You can do a for each. You can do all sorts of stuff. If you want it in a pretty table, you can just do your FT star yourself, and it will come out and give you a nice table for you. So it's really good how they did it, in that they give us the data and we get to format it if we want. But that looks prettier. But once we put it into a format table, I can't where clause that, I can't select from. It's just a blob. So it's really important as you go down the space of finding your sources, make sure that they give you the data as data, and then that you can make it your display if you want, but you don't have to. You can actually use it as a source to stuff it into a table. And these become properties in a variable. So I can do a variable equals get DBA disk space, and then say object.server, object.name. That's really cool. So just be aware when you start gathering data, you want data sources, not formatted sources. So WMI can be pretty powerful. And then we talked about the methods of gathering it. So I'm open for questions if there's more. Otherwise, hey, thanks for coming. Hopefully you'll be seeing us at PASS. And we'll see you at another virtual chapter meeting as well, or virtual group meeting for sure.
Yeah, I'm looking super forward to seeing you at Summit. I believe that that Aaron has left to do an IDERA presentation.
Okay, all right.
People do actually have questions, so I left this one for you to answer, because my answer I think that there's something that I use at Stack Exchange that it's pretty complicated. So Diana Gonzalez asked, how do you know if you have SMO and what version you have?
That is a great question. And I'll show you how you can tell. It's easy to, I mean, you can tell a lot of ways, but here's the way I'm going to tell you to tell, because it's pretty simple. There is a directory in C Windows called assembly, and it's really kind of a view, not really a directory, but it represents itself as a directory. The thing to know about SMO is it's always compiled in MSIL. So it's platform independent. So if you downloaded the SMO from the feature packs and it says x86 or x64, that's just about the directory that gets installed when you install that. It has nothing to do with the platform you can run it on. So everything in SMO is GAC MSIL. So it's all platform independent. So it doesn't matter 32 or 64. So you basically can remember this path. If you do a directory of that, it's just a path, and it has your Microsoft.SQLServer.SMO. And your SMO versions are right there. So if you do a directory for that directory, you can see which versions are actually on the box. And in this case, 12, 13, and 14.
Hey, I think that this is actually a really good opportunity for get DBA SMO version.
I actually have written a function for that, but I thought you had it already. So.
Yeah, no, we don't. And so I invite
totally happy
you
to put it in there.
to totally add this command, and then we can make it a lot easier for people.
Okay.
So much. I actually didn't know this at all. And that is a lot easier. So we do have one additional question. Well, Andy Egger said, thank you so much. But the question is, if order of columns matters, if you add a new data element to collect after the initial implementation, do you have to then just accommodate the existing position of the existing PK identity column that you avoided at the start?
Yes, so you have two options. You can rebuild the table, right, so that you have order. That's up to you. Or you can make your data that you're gathering fit the format of the table. So if you do alter table, add column, it'll be at the end of the the row. I mean, it'll be at the end of the table columns list. So the ordinal will be after your iteration ID. You would simply just add another column at the end of your gathering. So say your identity, well, actually iteration ID is not an identity in the gathering table. I made them so that they didn't have that. If you did have an identity, which some of my tables do, just for me to reference a specific row, you would just have to put a null column in your gathering and then put the column you're gathering that you added after that null column so that the identity still happens, because it will see a null and it won't try to insert data into that column, and then add the extra data piece after that. And as long as you maintain order in your gathering and your table, that's all you need to worry about.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
So,
hey, Mo,
2 options.
If you still have additional questions, I can't tell I don't know if you guys can just message and say that answered my question. You can join the SQL Server community Slack at sqlps.io/Slack. Ben is on there. He is DBA Duck.
Yep.
So he would be able to have a one-on-one conversation with you. There's another person that said, so Mark said, next level to this is to cycle through a ton of servers. How do you get around using different AD accounts to auth into different servers?
So typically you would, it's process based. So in order to get, typically SMO will default to your Windows auth. And if you want to use SQL auth, you can do that, but it will use your current credentials. So you would either need to create another PowerShell session session is basically what I do. I use remoting kind of. I do new PS session, use a different credential, and then when I go against that server, all of my SMO runs under that session, so it will use that authentication. Otherwise, you would use a SQL auth thing. I don't recommend that, but you can turn SMO and tell the connection context to be using not secure, which is meaning AD authentication, and you can set the username and password. But I typically use sessions is what I do. So I do a new PS session, and then I have a session, and I can run my invoke command, or I can do something with a session, and I can run it there. The other thing I do is enter PS session, so that I'm actually physically on that box with those credentials, and I can run my SMO as on this session, as if I'm on that box, but the SMO will run just like I run it in my local session. So I would say sessions is probably your best bet. If you have older OSs, you just need to make sure you go out there and enable -PS remoting to make sure that you have connection to get there. But otherwise, that's your options.
So I actually just pasted in. I was very surprised to learn and really excited. They messaged me so we have an internal command called connect SQL Server. And somebody was like, hey, I'm having a problem logging in to using my Windows credentials. And my position was, oh, well, SMO doesn't support alternative Windows credentials. It's only SQL authentication credentials. He's like, I'm using this code. And then he gave me the exact awesome code. And so I did paste in the code from the DBA tools library that you can use and repurpose. But it is possible to use SMO. The difference is it's called connect as user and connect as username.
Yep.
And then connect as user password. So you could just copy and paste from that. And this was something that I was really excited to learn about, I think maybe just 6 months ago. And it was by somebody, who they had a different problem. And I was like, oh, hey, I'm totally going to be using this. Thank you so much.
That is great to know, actually.
Yeah. So now we support, you running as the primary trusted connection, Windows authentication with a credential, and also SQL authentication. And we have to actually update all of our, or many of our commands, because many of them said, hey, you can only do, just run it as a different session, kind of what you were suggesting.
Yeah, right.
And so, it is possible to do it in all.
That is great. I like it. That's great. Good to know.
So do we have any other questions? Let's see. All right.
Great.
It seems like
Thanks for hanging around. This is great.
Yeah, this was a really awesome session, Ben. I always enjoy listening to you speak, and I look forward to hopefully we can see each other in each other's sessions at the summit.
That'd be great.
And everyone. So yeah, like we said before, it seems like SQL Summit is going to be heavy on PowerShell this year. I hope that it really delivers. And if you keep up with us on Twitter at twitter.com/SQL PowerShell, we will be promoting any and all PowerShell sessions. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.